Recorded Books presents an unabridged recording of How to Read and Why by Harold Bloom, narrated by John McDonough. This work is copyrighted 2000 by Harold Bloom. This recording is copyrighted 2001 by Recorded Books. Harold Bloom is Sterling Professor at Yale University, Bird Professor of English at New York University, and a former Charles Eliot Norton Professor at Harvard, as well as a noted author. In this book, he discusses the benefits and pleasures of reading well. And now, how to read and why.
The reader became the book, and summer night was like the conscious being of the book. Wallace Stevens. Preface. There is no single way to read well, though there is a prime reason why we should read. Information is endlessly available to us. Where shall wisdom be found? If you are fortunate, you encounter a particular teacher who can help. Yet finally you are alone, going on without further mediation. Reading well is one of the great pleasures that solitude can afford you, because it is, at least in my experience, the most healing of pleasures. It returns you to otherness, whether in yourself or in friends, or in those who may become friends. Imaginative literature is otherness, and as such, alleviates loneliness. We read not only because we cannot know enough people, but because friendship is so vulnerable, so likely to diminish or disappear, overcome by space, time, imperfect sympathies, and all the sorrows of familial and passional life. This book teaches how to read and why, proceeding by a multitude of examples and instances. Poems short and long, stories and novels and plays. The selections should not be interpreted as an exclusive list of what to read, but rather as a sampling of works that best illustrate why to read. Reading well is best pursued as an implicit discipline. Finally, there is no method but yourself, when yourself has been fully molded. Literary criticism, as I have learned to understand it, ought to be experiential and pragmatic, rather than theoretical. The critics who are my masters, Dr. Samuel Johnson and William Hazlitt in particular, practice their art in order to make what is implicit in a book finally explicit. In what follows, whether I deal with a lyric by A.E. Housman, or a play by Oscar Wilde, with a story by Jorge Luis Borges, or a novel by Marcel Proust, my principal concern will be with the ways of noticing and realizing what can and should be made explicit. Because for me, the question of how to read always leads on to the motives and uses of reading. I shall never separate the how and the why of this book's subject. Virginia Woolf, in How Should One Read a Book, the final brief essay in her second Common Reader, charmingly warns, the only advice indeed that one person can give another about reading is to take no advice. But she then adds many codicils to the reader's enjoyment of freedom, culminating in the grand question, where are we to begin? To get the deepest and widest pleasures of reading, we must not squander our powers helplessly and ignorantly. So it seems that until we become wholly ourselves, some advice about reading may be helpful, even perhaps essential. Woolf herself had found that advice in Walter Pater, whose sister had tutored her, and also in Dr. Johnson, and in the Romantic critics Thomas de Quincey and William Hazlitt, of whom she wonderfully remarked, "He is one of those rare critics who have thought so much that they can dispense with reading." Woolf thought incessantly and never would stop reading. She herself had a good deal of advice to give to other readers, and I have happily taken it throughout this book. Her best advice is to remind us that there is always a demon in us who whispers, "I hate, I love," and we cannot silence him. I cannot silence my demon, but in this book anyway, I will listen to him only when he whispers, "I love," as I intend no polemics here, but only to teach reading. Prologue. Why read? It matters, if individuals are to retain any capacity to form their own judgments and opinions, that they continue to read for themselves. How they read, well or badly, and what they read, cannot depend wholly upon themselves, but why they read must be for and in their own interest. You can read merely to pass the time, or you can read with an overt urgency, but eventually you will read against the clock. Bible readers, those who search the Bible for themselves, perhaps exemplify the urgency more plainly than readers of Shakespeare, yet the quest is the same. One of the uses of reading is to prepare ourselves for change, and the final change, alas, is universal. I turn to reading as a solitary praxis rather than as an educational enterprise. The way we read now, when we are alone with ourselves, retains considerable continuity with the past, however it is performed in the academies. My ideal reader and lifelong hero is Dr. Samuel Johnson, who knew and expressed both the power and the limitation of incessant reading. Like every other activity of the mind, it must satisfy Johnson's prime concern, which is with what comes near to ourself, what we can put to use. Sir Francis Bacon, who provided some of the ideas that Johnson put to use, famously gave the advice, "Read not to contradict and confute, nor to believe and take for granted, nor to find talk and discourse, but to weigh and consider." I add to Bacon and Johnson a third sage of reading, Emerson, fierce enemy of history and of all historicisms, who remarked that the best books impress us with the conviction that one nature wrote and the same reads. Let me fuse Bacon, Johnson, and Emerson into a formula of how to read. Find what comes near to you that can be put to the use of weighing and considering, and that addresses you as though you share the one nature, free of time's tyranny. Pragmatically, that means first find Shakespeare and let him find you. If King Lear is fully to find you, then weigh and consider the nature it shares with you, its closeness to yourself. I do not intend this as an idealism, but as a pragmatism. Putting the tragedy to use as a complaint against patriarchy is to forsake your own prime interests, particularly as a young woman, which sounds rather more ironical than it is. Shakespeare, more than Sophocles, is the inescapable authority upon intergenerational conflict, and more than anyone else, upon the differences between women and men. Be open to a full reading of King Lear, and you will understand better the origins of what you judge to be patriarchy. Ultimately, we read, as Bacon, Johnson, and Emerson agree, in order to strengthen the self and to learn its authentic interests. We experience such augmentations as pleasure, which may be why aesthetic values have always been deprecated by social moralists, from Plato through our current campus Puritans. The pleasures of reading indeed are selfish rather than social. You cannot directly improve anyone else's life by reading better or more deeply. I remain skeptical of the traditional social hope that care for others may be stimulated by the growth of individual imagination, and I am wary of any arguments whatsoever that connect the pleasures of solitary reading to the public good. The sorrow of professional reading is that you recapture only rarely the pleasure of reading you knew in youth, when books were a Hasletian gusto. The way we read now partly depends upon our distance, inner or outer, from the universities, where reading is scarcely taught as a pleasure in any of the deeper senses of the aesthetics of pleasure. Opening yourself to a direct confrontation with Shakespeare at his strongest, as in King Lear, is never an easy pleasure, whether in youth or in age. And yet, not to read King Lear fully, which means without ideological expectations, is to be cognitively as well as aesthetically defrauded. A childhood largely spent watching television yields to an adolescence with a computer, and the university receives a student unlikely to welcome the suggestion that we must endure our going hence, even as our going hither. Ripeness is all. Reading falls apart, and much of the self scatters with it. All this is past lamenting, and will not be remedied by any vows or programs. What is to be done can only be performed by some version of elitism, and that is now unacceptable for reasons both good and bad. There are still solitary readers, young and old, everywhere, even in the universities. If there is a function of criticism at the present time, it must be to address itself to the solitary reader who reads for herself, and not for the interests that supposedly transcend the self. Value in literature, as in life, has much to do with the idiosyncratic, with the excess by which meaning gets started. It is not accidental that historicists, critics who believe all of us to be overdetermined by societal history, should also regard literary characters as marks upon a page, and nothing more. Hamlet is not even a case history if our thoughts are not at all our own. I come then to the first principle if we are to restore the way we read now, a principle I appropriate from Dr. Johnson. Clear your mind of cant. Your dictionary will tell you that cant, in this sense, is speech overflowing with pious platitudes, the peculiar vocabulary of a sect or coven. Since the universities have empowered such covens as gender and sexuality and multiculturalism, Johnson's admonition thus becomes clear your mind of academic cant. A university culture where the appreciation of Victorian women's underwear replaces the appreciation of Charles Dickens and Robert Browning sounds like the outrageousness of a new Nathaniel West, but is merely the norm. A side product of such cultural poetics is that there can be no new Nathaniel West, for how could such an academic culture sustain parity? The poems of our climate have been replaced by the body stockings of our culture. Our new materialists tell us that they have recovered the body for historicism and assert that they work in the name of the reality principle. The life of the mind must yield to the death of the body, yet that hardly requires the cheerleading of an academic sect. Clear your mind of cant leads on to the second principle of restoring reading. Do not attempt to improve your neighbor or your neighborhood by what or how you read. Self-improvement is a large enough project for your mind and spirit. There are no ethics of reading. The mind should be kept at home until its primal ignorance has been purged. Premature excursions into activism have their charm, but are time-consuming, and for reading, there will never be enough time. Historicizing, whether of past or present, is a kind of idolatry, an obsessive worship of things in time. Read, therefore, by the inner light that John Milton celebrated, and that Emerson took as a principle of reading, which can be our third. A scholar is a candle which the love and desire of all men will light. Wallace Stevens, perhaps forgetting his source, wrote marvelous variations upon that metaphor, but the original Emersonian phrasing makes for a clearer statement of the third principle of reading. You need not fear that the freedom of your development as a reader is selfish, because if you become an authentic reader, then the response to your labors will confirm you as an illumination to others. I ponder the letters that I received from strangers these last 7 or 8 years, and generally I am too moved to reply. Their pathos for me is that all too often they testify to a yearning for canonical literary study that universities disdain to fulfill. Emerson said that society cannot do without cultivated men and women, and prophetically he added, "The people and not the college is the writer's home." He meant strong writers, representative men and women who represented themselves and not constituencies, since his politics were those of the spirit. The largely forgotten function of a university education is caught forever in Emerson's address, The American Scholar, when he says of the scholar's duties, "They may all be comprised in self-trust." I take from Emerson also my fourth principle of reading. One must be an inventor to read well. Creative reading, in Emerson's sense, I once named as misreading, a word that persuaded opponents that I suffered from a voluntary dyslexia. The ruin or blank that they see when they look at a poem is in their own eye. Self-trust is not an endowment, but is the second birth of the mind, which cannot come without years of deep reading. There are no absolute standards for the aesthetic. If you wish to maintain that Shakespeare's ascendancy was a product of colonialism, then who will bother to confute you? Shakespeare, after 4 centuries, is more pervasive than ever he was before. They will perform him in outer space and on other worlds, if those worlds are reached. He is not a conspiracy of Western culture. He contains every principle of reading, and he is my touchstone throughout this book. Borges attributed this universalism to Shakespeare's apparent selflessness, but that quality is a large metaphor for Shakespeare's difference, which finally is cognitive power as such. We read, frequently if unknowingly, in quest of a mind more original than our own. Since ideology, particularly in its shallower versions, is peculiarly destructive of the capacity to apprehend and appreciate irony, I suggest that the recovery of the ironic might be our fifth principle for the restoration of reading. Think of the endless irony of Hamlet, who, when he says one thing, almost invariably means another, frequently indeed the opposite of what he says. But with this principle I am close to despair, since you can no more teach someone to be ironic than you can instruct them to become solitary. And yet, the loss of irony is the death of reading, and of what had been civilized in our natures. I stepped from plank to plank, a slow and cautious way. The stars about my head I felt, about my feet the sea. I knew not but the next would be my final inch. This gave me that precarious gait some call experience. Women and men can walk differently, but unless we are regimented, we all tend to walk somewhat individually. Dickinson, master of the precarious sublime, can hardly be apprehended if we are dead to her ironies. She is walking the only path available from plank to plank, but her slow caution ironically juxtaposes with a titanism in which she feels the stars about my head, though her feet very nearly are in the sea. not knowing whether the next step will be her final inch, gives her that precarious gait she will not name, except to tell us that some call it experience. She had read Emerson's essay, Experience. A culmination much in the way of experience was for his master Montaigne, and her irony is an amiable response to Emerson's opening. Where do we find ourselves? In a series of which we do not know the extremes and believe that it has none. The extreme, for Dickinson, is the not knowing whether the next step is the final end. If any of us knew what we were doing or where we are going, then when we think we best know. Emerson's further reverie differs from Dickinson's in temperament, or as she words it, in gait. All things swim and glitter in Emerson's realm of experience, and his genial irony is very different from her irony of precariousness. Yet neither is an ideologue, and they live still in the rival power of their ironies. At the end of the path of lost irony is a final inch, beyond which literary value will be irrecoverable. Irony is only a metaphor, and the irony of one literary age can rarely be the irony of another. Yet without the renaissance of an ironic sense, more than what we once called imaginative literature will be lost. Thomas Mann, most ironic of this century's great writers, seems to be lost already. New biographies of him appear, and are reviewed almost always on the basis of his homoeroticism, as though he can be saved for our interest only if he can be certified as gay, and so gain a place in our curriculum. That is akin to studying Shakespeare mostly for his apparent bisexuality. But the vagaries of our current counter-Puritanism seem limitless. Shakespeare's ironies, as we would expect, are the most comprehensive and dialectical in all of Western literature, and yet they do not always mediate his characters' passions for us, so vast and intense is their emotional range. Shakespeare, therefore, will survive our era. We will lose his ironies and hold on to the rest of him. But in Thomas Mann, every emotion, narrative or dramatic, is mediated by an ironic aestheticism. To teach death in Venice, or disorder at early sorrow, to most current undergraduates, even the gifted, is nearly impossible. When authors are destroyed by history, we rightly call their work period pieces. But when they are made unavailable through historicized ideology, I think that we encounter a different phenomenon. Irony demands a certain attention span and the ability to sustain antithetical ideas, even when they collide with one another. Strip irony away from reading, and it loses at once all discipline and all surprise. Find now what comes near to you that can be used for weighing and considering, and it very likely will be irony, even if many of your teachers will not know what it is or where it is to be found. Irony will clear your mind of the cant of the ideologues and help you to blaze forth as the scholar of one candle. Going on 70, one doesn't want to read badly any more than live badly, since time will not relent. I don't know that we owe God or nature a death, but nature will collect anyway, and we certainly owe mediocrity nothing, whatever collectivity it purports to advance or at least represent. Because my ideal reader for half a century has been Dr. Samuel Johnson, I turn next to my favorite passage in his Preface to Shakespeare. This, therefore, is the praise of Shakespeare, that his drama is the mirror of life, that he who has mazed his imagination in following the phantoms which other writers raise up before him may here be cured of his delirious ecstasies by reading human sentiments in human language, by scenes from which a hermit may estimate the transactions of the world, and a confessor predict the progress of the passions. To read human sentiments in human language, you must be able to read humanly with all of you. You are more than an ideology, whatever your convictions, and Shakespeare speaks to as much of you as you can bring to him. That is to say, Shakespeare reads you more fully than you can read him, even after you have cleared your mind of cant. No writer before or since Shakespeare has had anything like his control of perspectivism, which outleaps any contextualizations we impose upon the plays. Johnson, admirably perceiving this, urges us to allow Shakespeare to cure us of our delirious ecstasies. Let me extend Johnson by also urging us to recognize the phantoms that the deep reading of Shakespeare will exorcise. One such phantom is the death of the author. Another is the assertion that the self is a fiction. Yet another is the opinion that literary and dramatic characters are so many marks upon a page. A fourth phantom, and the most pernicious, is that language does the thinking for us. Still, my love for Johnson and for reading turns me at last away from polemic and towards a celebration of the many solitary readers I keep encountering, whether in the classroom or in messages I receive. We read Shakespeare, Dante, Chaucer, Cervantes, Dickens, Proust, and all their peers because they more than enlarge life. Pragmatically, they have become the blessing in its true Yahwistic sense of more life into a time without boundaries. We read deeply for varied reasons, most of them familiar, that we cannot know enough people profoundly enough, that we need to know ourselves better, that we require knowledge not just of self and others, but of the way things are. Yet the strongest, most authentic motive for deep reading of the now much abused traditional canon is the search for a difficult pleasure. I am not exactly an erotics of reading purveyor, and a pleasurable difficulty seems to me a plausible definition of the sublime. But a higher pleasure remains the reader's quest. There is a reader's sublime, and it seems the only secular transcendence we can ever attain, except for the even more precarious transcendence we call falling in love. I urge you to find what truly comes near to you, that can be used for weighing and for considering. Read deeply, not to believe, not to accept, not to contradict, but to learn to share in that one nature that writes and reads. Chapter 1, Short Stories. Introduction. The Irish writer Franz Kafka celebrated the short story in his lonely voice, believing that it dealt best with isolated individuals, particularly those upon society's fringes. If this were wholly true, the short story would have developed almost into the opposite of one of its likeliest origins, the folk tale. Then the short story, unlike the lyrical poem, would wound once and once only, and also unlike novels, which can afflict us with many sensations, with multiple sorrows and joys. But so indeed can the stories of Chekhov and his few peers. Short stories are not parables or wise sayings, and so cannot be fragments. We ask them for the pleasures of closure. Kafka's magnificent fragment, The Hunter Gracchus, ends when the undead hunter, a kind of wandering Jew or ancient mariner, is asked by a sea town's mayor how long he intends to prolong his visit. "I cannot tell, Burgomeister," Gracchus replies. "My ship has no rudder and is driven by a wind that rises from the icy regions of death." That is not closure, but what could Kafka have added? Gracchus's final sentence is more memorable than all but a few deliberate endings of stories. How does one read a short story? Edgar Allan Poe would have said, at one sitting. Poe's stories, despite their permanent worldwide popularity, are atrociously written, as are his poems, and benefit by translation, even into English. But Poe is hardly one of the authentic ancestors of the modern short story. These include Pushkin and Balzac, Gogol and Turgenev, Maupassant and Chekhov, and Henry James. The modern masters of the form are James Joyce and D.H. Lawrence, Isaac Babel and Ernest Hemingway, and a varied group including Borges, Nabokov, Thomas Mann, Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, Tommaso Landolfi, and Italo Calvino. I will center here upon stories by Turgenev and by Chekhov, by Maupassant and by Hemingway, by Flannery O'Connor and by Vladimir Nabokov, Jorge Luis Borges, Tommaso Landolfi, and by Italo Calvino, because all of them achieved something like perfection in their art. Ivan Turgenev. Frank O'Connor said Turgenev's Sketches from a Hunter's Album, 1852, over any other single volume of short stories. A century and a half after its composition, Sketches remains astonishingly fresh, though its topicality, the need to emancipate the serfs, has yielded to all the disasters of Russian history. Turgenev's stories are uncannily beautiful. Taken together, they are as magnificent an answer to the question, why read, as I know, always excepting Shakespeare. Turgenev, who loved Shakespeare and Cervantes, divided up all mankind of the questing sword into either Hamlets or Don Quixotes. He might have added Falstaffs or Sancho Panzas, since with Hamlet and the Don, they form a fourfold paradigm for so many other fictive beings. It is difficult to single out particular stories from the 25 in Sketches, but I join several other critics in a special fondness for Biejin Li, or Meadow, and Kesyan from the Beautiful Lands. Biejin Li begins on a beautiful July morning with Turgenev out grouse shooting. The hunter loses his way and comes at night to a meadowland where a group of 5 peasant boys sit around 2 fires. Joining them, Turgenev introduces us to them. They range in age from 7 to 14, and all of them believe in goblins, the little people who share their room. Turgenev's art wisely allows the boys to talk to one another, while he listens and does not intrude. Their life of hard work, they and their parents are serfs, superstition, village legend, is revealed to us complete with Trishka, the Antichrist to come, enticing mermaids who catch souls, the walking dead, and those marked to die. One boy, Pavlusha, stands out from the rest as the most intelligent and likable. He demonstrates his courage when he rushes forth barehanded to drive away what could be wolves who threaten the grazing horses that the boys guard in the night. After some hours, Turgenev falls asleep, to wake up just before dawn. The boys sleep on, though Pavlusha raises himself up for a last intense glance at the hunter. Turgenev starts home, describing the beautiful morning, and then ends the sketch by adding that later that year, Pavlusha died in a fall from a horse. We feel the pity of the loss with Turgenev, who remarks that Pavlusha was a fine boy, but the pathos of the death is not rendered as such. A continuum engages us. The beauty of the meadow and of the dawn, the vividness of the boy's preternatural beliefs, the fate not to be evaded that takes away Pavlusha. And the rest? That is the pragmatic yet somehow still quixotic Turgenev, shooting his grouse, and sketching the boys and the landscape in his album. Why read Biagin Lee? At the least, to know better our own reality, our vulnerability to fate, while learning also to appreciate aesthetically Turgenev's tact and only apparent detachment as a storyteller. If there is any irony in this sketch, it belongs to fate itself, a fate just about as innocent as the landscape, the boys, the hunter. Turgenev is one of the most Shakespearean of writers in that he too refrains from moral judgments. He also knows that a favorite, like Pavlusha, will vanish by a sudden accident. There is no single interpretive point to carry away from the Biagin Meadow. The narrative voice is not to be distinguished from Turgenev's own self, which is wisely passive, loving, meticulously observant. That self, like Pavlusha's, is part of the story's value. Something in most of us is where it wants to be, with the boys, the horses, the compassionate hunter-writer, the talk of goblins and river temptresses, in perfect weather, in Biagin. To achieve Turgenev's apparent simplicity as a writer of sketches, you need the highest gifts, something very like Shakespeare's genius for rediscovering the human. Turgenev, too, shows us something that perhaps is always there, but that we could not see without him. Dostoevsky learned from Shakespeare how to create the supreme nihilists, Svidrigaïlov and Stavrogin, by observing Iago, satanic majesty of all nihilists. Turgenev, like Henry James, learned something subtler from Shakespeare, the mystery of the seemingly commonplace, the rendering of a reality that is perpetually augmenting. Directly after Biagin Lee comes Kasyan from the Beautiful Lands, where Turgenev gives us a fully miraculous character, the dwarf Kasyan, a mystical serf and faith healer, perhaps a sect of one. Returning from a hunting trip, the author's horse-drawn cart suffers a broken axle. In a nearby town that is no town, Turgenev and his surly driver encounter a dwarf of about 50 years old with a small, swarthy, wrinkled face, a little painted nose, barely discernible little brown eyes, and abundant curly black hair which sat upon his tiny head just as broadly as the cap sits on the stalk of a mushroom. His entire body was extraordinarily frail and thin. Translated by Richard Freeborn. We are constantly reminded how uncanny, how unexpected Kasyan truly is. Though his voice invariably is gentle and sweet, he severely condemns hunting as ungodly, and he maintains throughout a strong dignity as well as the sorrow of an exile resettled by the authorities and so deprived of the beautiful lands of the Don region. Everything about little Kasyan is paradoxical. Turgenev's driver explains that the dwarf is a holy man, known as the Flea. Hunter and healer go off together for a walk in the woods while the axle is being mended. Gathering herbs, jumping as he goes, muttering to himself, Kasyan speaks to the birds in their own language, but says not a word to Turgenev. Driven by the heat to find shelter together in the bushes, Hunter and Holy Dwarf enjoy their silent reveries until Kasyan demands justification for the shooting of birds. When Turgenev asks the dwarf's occupation, Kasyan replies that he catches nightingales to give them away to others, that he is literate and admits his healing powers. And though he says he has no family, his secret is revealed. His small, teenage, natural daughter, Anushka, suddenly appears in the woods. The child is beautiful and shy and has been out gathering mushrooms. Though Kasyan denies his parentage, neither we nor Turgenev are persuaded. And after the child departs, Kasyan scarcely speaks for the remainder of the story. We are left with enigmas, as his driver can scarcely enlighten Turgenev when they depart. To him, Kasyan is nothing but contradictions, untellable. Nothing more is told, and Turgenev returns home. His thoughts on Kasyan remain unexpressed, but do we need them? The peasant healer lives in his own world, not the Russia of the serfs, but a Russian vision of the biblical world, albeit totally unlike the rival biblical visions of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Kasyan, though he shies away from rebellion, has rejected Russian society and returned to the arts and ways of the folk. He will not let his daughter abide a moment in the presence of the benign Turgenev, who admires the child's beauty. One need not idealize Kasyan. His peasant shrewdness and perceptions exclude a great deal of value, but he incarnates truths of folklore that he himself may scarcely know that he knows. The dominant atmosphere of Turgenev's sketches is the beauty of the landscape when experienced in ideal weather. Yet there is a large difference between the natural beauty shared by Turgenev and the peasant boys in Biezhenli, and the something less than communion between Kasyan and Turgenev when they shade themselves in the forest. Pavlusha's fate cannot be resisted, only accepted, but Kasyan is, in his own subtle way, as much a magical master of reality as Shakespeare's Prospero was. Kasyan's magical natural world is not akin to Turgenev's aesthetically apprehended nature, even when holy man and hunter-writer rest side by side. Nor will Kasyan admit Turgenev into his secret or even a momentary exchange with his beautiful elf of a daughter. Finally, we come to see that Kasyan is still from the beautiful lands, even though he has lost his original home near the Don. The beautiful lands belong to closed folk tradition, of which Kasyan is a kind of shaman. We read Kasyan from the beautiful lands to attain a vision of otherness, closed to all but a few of us, and closed to Turgenev as well. The reward for reading Kasyan's story is that we are admitted, very briefly, into an alternate reality where Turgenev himself entered only briefly, and yet sublimely brought back in his sketches. Anton Chekhov. It is a long journey from Turgenev's stories to Chekhov's and Hemingway's, even though the Nick Adams stories could have been called sketches from a fisherman's album. Still, Turgenev, Chekhov, and Hemingway share a quality that looks like detachment and turns out to be something else. Their affinity with their landscape and human figures is central in Turgenev, Chekhov, and Hemingway. This is very different from the sense of immersion in social worlds and in geysers of characters in Balzac and in Dickens. The genius of both novelists was lavish at peopling Paris and London with entire social classes, as well as grotesquely impressive individuals. Balzac, unlike Dickens, excelled also at the short story and built many of them into his human comedy. Yet they lack the resonances of Balzac's novels and cannot compare to the stories of Turgenev and Chekhov, Maupassant, and Hemingway. Even Chekhov's earliest stories can have the formal delicacy and somber reflectiveness that make him the indispensable artist of the unlived life and the major influence upon all story writers after him. I say all because Chekhov's formal innovations as a storyteller, though profuse, are less consequential than his Shakespearean inwardness, his carrying over into the stories, longer or shorter, the major newness in Shakespeare's characterizations, a foregrounding that I discuss elsewhere in this book in regard to Hamlet. In a sense, Chekhov was more Shakespearean even than Turgenev, who in his novels took care to background the earlier lives of his protagonists. One should write, Chekhov said, so that the reader needs no explanations from the author. The actions, conversations, and meditations of the characters had to be sufficient. A practice followed also in Chekhov's finest plays, Three Sisters and The Cherry Orchard. My favorite early Chekhov story is The Kiss, written when he was 27. Rabovich, the shyest, drabbest, and most retiring officer in an artillery brigade, accompanies his fellow officers to an evening social at the country manor of a retired general. Wandering about the house, the bored Rabovich enters a dark room and experiences an adventure. Mistaking him for someone else, a woman kisses him and recoils. He rushes away and henceforth is obsessed with the encounter, which initially brings exultation, but then becomes a torment. The wretched fellow is in love, albeit with a woman totally unknown and never to be encountered again. When his brigade next approaches the general's manor, Rabovich walks upon a little bridge near the bathhouse where he reaches out and touches a wet sheet hanging there to dry. A sensation of cold and roughness assails him, and he glances down at the water, where a red moon is reflected. Staring at the flowing water, Rabovich experiences a conviction that all of life is an incoherent joke. In the story's close, all the other officers have returned to the general's house, but Rabovich goes to his solitary bed. Except for the kiss itself, that touch of the cold, wet sheet, the anti-kiss, as it were, is the dominant moment of the story. It destroys Rabovich, but then so does the kiss. Hope and joy, however irrational, are stronger than despair, and ultimately more pernicious. I read The Kiss and repeat to myself an observation I once made in writing about Chekhov. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you despair, is Chekhov's gospel, except that this gloomy genius insists upon being cheerful. Rabovich may think that his fate in life is settled, but it certainly isn't, though we will never know, since that lies beyond the story. The best observations on Chekhov, and on Tolstoy also, that I've ever read, are in Maxim Gorky's Reminiscences, where we are told, "It seems to me that in the presence of Chekhov, everyone felt an unconscious desire to be simpler, more truthful, more himself." When I reread The Kiss or attend a good performance of Three Sisters, I am in Chekhov's presence, and while he doesn't make me simpler, more truthful, more myself, I do wish I could be better, though I can't be. My wish seems to me an aesthetic rather than a moral phenomenon, because Chekhov has a great writer's wisdom and teaches me implicitly that literature is a form of the good. Shakespeare and Beckett teach me the same, which is why I read. Sometimes I reflect that of all the writers whose inner biographies are known, Chekhov and Beckett were the kindest human beings. Of Shakespeare's inner life we know nothing, but if you read the plays incessantly, then you suspect that this wisest of persons must be a third with Chekhov and Beckett. The creator of Sir John Falstaff, of Hamlet, and of Rosalind in As You Like It, also makes me wish I could be more myself. But that, as I argue throughout this book, is why we should read, and why we should read only the best of what has been written. The Kiss is early work, however marvelous. Chekhov himself thought his best story was the three-page The Student, composed when he was 33, the age when Jesus died, according to tradition. Like Shakespeare, Chekhov cannot be called either a believer or a skeptic. They are too large for such a categorization. The Student is ardently simple, though beautifully arranged. A young clerical student, cold and hungry, comes upon two widows, mother and daughter, on Good Friday. He warms himself at their campfire and tells them the story of how the apostle Peter denied Jesus 3 times, as Jesus had prophesied. Peter, returning to himself, wept bitterly, and so does the widowed mother. The student goes off and broods on the relation between the apostle's tears and the mother's, which seem linked in an unbroken train. Joy suddenly stirs in the student because he feels that truth and beauty persist in and by this chain that binds past to present. And that is all. The story ends with the student's transformation of this sudden joy into an expectation of a happiness still to come to his life. He was only 22, Chekhov dryly remarks, perhaps having an intimation that he himself, at 33, had already lived 3/4 of his life. He died of tuberculosis at 44. The reader can reflect upon the subtle transition in the student's joy from a past to present train of truth and beauty to a 22-year-old's anticipation of a not impossible personal happiness. It is Good Friday, and the tale within a tale is of Jesus and Simon Peter, and yet neither of the rejoicings has any trace of authentic piety or of salvation. Chekhov, the subtlest dramatic psychologist since Shakespeare himself, has written a dark lyric about suffering and change. Jesus is present only as a supreme representation of suffering and change, one that Shakespeare, in his dangerous era, shrewdly and invariably avoided. Why did Chekhov prefer this short story to scores of what seemed to many of his admirers far more consequential and vital tales? I have no clear answer, but regard the question as worthy of pondering. Nothing in The Student, except what happens in the protagonist's mind, is anything but dreadfully dismal. It is the irrational rise of impersonal joy and personal hope out of cold and misery and the tears of betrayal that appears to have moved Chekhov himself. A late story, The Lady with the Dog, of 1899, is among my favorites by Chekhov, and is generally regarded as being one of his finest. Gurov, a married man vacationing alone in Yalta, the seaside resort, is moved by encountering a fair young woman, always accompanied by her white Pomeranian. An incessant womanizer, Gurov begins an affair with the lady Anna Sergeyevna, herself unhappily married. She departs, insisting that the farewell must be forever. Experienced amorist as he is, Gurov accepts this with an autumnal relief and returns to his wife and children in Moscow, only to find himself haunted and suffering. Has he fallen in love, presumably for the first time? He does not know, nor does Chekhov, so we cannot know either. Yet he is certainly obsessed, and therefore travels to Anna Sergeyevna's provincial town, where he seeks her out when she attends the opera. Anguished, she urges him to go immediately, promising that she will visit him in Moscow. The Moscow meetings, every 2 or 3 months, become a tradition, enjoyable enough for Gurov, but hardly for the perpetually weeping Anna Sergeyevna, until at last, catching sight of himself in a mirror, Gurov sees that his hair is graying, and simultaneously awakens to the incessant dilemma he has entered, which he interprets as his belated falling in love. What is to be done? Gurov at once feels that he and his beloved are on the verge of a beautiful new life, and also that the end of the relationship is far off, and the hardest part of their mutual travail has just begun. That is all Chekhov gives us, but the reverberations go on long after this conclusion that concludes nothing. Gurov and Anna Sergeyevna are evidently both somewhat changed, but not necessarily for the better. Nothing either can do for the other is redemptive. What then redeems their story from its mundane staleness? How does it differ from the tale of every other hapless adultery? Not by our interest in Gurov and Anna, as any reader would have to conclude. There is nothing remarkable about them. He is another womanizer, and she another weeping woman. Chekhov's artistry is never more mysterious than here, where it is palpable yet scarcely definable. Clearly Anna is in love, though Gurov is hardly a worthy object. Just how to value the mournful Anna we cannot know. What passes between the lovers is presented by Chekhov with such detachment that we lack not information but judgment, including our own. For the story is weirdly laconic in its universalism. Does Gurov really believe that at last he has fallen in love? He has no clue, nor does the reader, and if Chekhov knows, he won't tell us. As in Shakespeare, where Hamlet tells us that he loves, and we don't know if we can believe him, we are not tempted to trust Gurov's assertion that this at last is the real right thing. Anna complains bitterly that theirs is a dark, secret love, to use William Blake's great phrase from his The Sick Rose. But Gurov seems to revel in the secret life which he thinks uncovers his true self. He is a banker, and doubtless many bankers have true selves, but Gurov isn't one of them. The reader can credit Anna's tears, but not Gurov's how, as he clutches his head. Chekhov in Love parodied himself in The Seagull's Trigorin, and I suggest that Gurov is a more transposed self-parody. We don't much like Gurov, and we want Anna to stop crying, but we cannot cast their story off, because it is our story. Gorky says of Chekhov that he was able to reveal in the dim sea of banality its tragic humor. It sounds naive, and yet Chekhov's greatest power is to give us the impression as we read that here at last is the truth about human existence's constant blend of banal misery and tragic joy. Shakespeare was Chekhov's and our authority on tragic joy, but the banal does not appear in Shakespeare, even when he writes travesty or farce. Guy de Maupassant. Chekhov had learned from Maupassant how to represent banality. Maupassant, who had learned everything including that from his master Flaubert, rarely matches the genius of Chekhov or of Turgenev as a storyteller. Lev Shestov, a remarkable Russian religious thinker of the earlier 20th century, expressed this with considerable force. Chekhov's wonderful art did not die, his art to kill by a mere touch, a breath, a glance, everything whereby men live and wherein they take their pride. And in the art he was constantly perfecting himself, and he attained to a virtuosity beyond the reach of any of his rivals in European literature. Maupassant often had to strain every effort to overcome his victim. The victim often escaped from Maupassant, though crushed and broken, yet with his life. In Chekhov's hands, nothing escaped him. That is a very dark view, and no reader wants to think of herself as a writer's victim. And yet Shestov accurately weighs Maupassant against Chekhov, rather as one might weigh Christopher Marlowe against Shakespeare. Yet Maupassant is the best of the really popular story writers, vastly superior to O. Henry, who could be and greatly preferable to the abominable Poe. To be an artist of the popular is itself an extraordinary achievement. We have nothing like it in the United States today. Chekhov can seem simple, but is always profoundly subtle. Many of Maupassant's simplicities are merely what they seem to be, yet they are not shallow. Maupassant had learned from his teacher Flaubert that talent is a prolonged patience, and seeing what others tend not to see. Whether Maupassant can make us see what we could never have seen without him, I very much doubt. That calls for the genius of Shakespeare or of Chekhov. There is also the problem that Maupassant, like so many 19th and early 20th century writers of fiction, saw everything through the lens of Arthur Schopenhauer, philosopher of the will to live. I would just as soon wear Schopenhauerian as Freudian goggles, both enlarge and both distort almost equally. But I am a literary critic, not a story writer, and Maupassant would have done better to discard philosophical spectacles when he contemplated the vagaries of the desires of men and the women. At his best, he is marvelously readable, whether in the humorous pathos of Madame Tellier's establishment, or in a horror story like The Horla, both of which I shall consider here. Frank O'Connor insisted that Maupassant's stories were not satisfactory when compared to those of Chekhov and Turgenev, but then few story writers rival the two Russian masters. O'Connor's real objection was that he thought the sexual act itself turns into a form of murder in Maupassant. A reader who has just enjoyed Madame Tellier's establishment would hardly agree. Flaubert, who did not live to write it, wished to set his final novel in a provincial whorehouse, which his son had already done in this robust story. Everyone in Madame Tellier's establishment is benign and amiable, which is part of the story's authentic charm. Madame Tellier, a respectable Norman peasant, keeps her establishment as one might run an inn or even a boarding school. Her 5 sex workers, as some call them now, are vividly, even lovingly described by Maupassant, who emphasizes the peace kept in the house by Madame's talent for conciliation and her incessant good humor. On an evening in May, none of the regular clients are in good humor because the establishment is festooned with a notice, "Closed for a first communion." Madame and her staff have gone off for this event, the celebrant being Madame's niece and goddaughter. The first communion develops into an extraordinary occasion when the prolonged weeping of the whores, moved to remember their own girlhoods, becomes contagious, and the entire congregation is swept by an ecstasy of tears. The priest proclaims that the Holy Christ has descended, and particularly thanks the visitors, Madame Tellier and her staff. After a boisterous trip back to their establishment, Madame and her ladies return to their ordinary evening labors, performed, however, with more than the routine zest and in high good spirits. It isn't every day we have something to celebrate, Madame Tellier concludes the story by remarking, and only a joyless reader declines to celebrate with her. For once, at least, Schopenhauer's disciple has broken loose from gloomy reflections on the close relations between sex and death. Exuberance in storytelling is hard to resist, and Maupassant never writes with more gusto than in Madame Tellier's establishment. This tale of Normandy has warmth, laughter, surprise, and even a kind of spiritual insight. The Pentecostal ecstasy that burns through the congregation is as authentic as the weeping of the whores that ignites it. Maupassant's irony is markedly kinder, though less subtle, than his master Flaubert's. And the story is bawdy, not prurient, in the Shakespearean spirit. It enlarges life and diminishes no one. Maupassant's own life ended badly. By his late 20s, he was syphilitic. At 39, the disease affected his mind, and he spent his final years locked in an asylum after a suicide attempt. His most upsetting horror story, The Horla, has a complex and ambiguous relation to his illness and its consequences. The nameless protagonist of the story is perhaps a syphilitic going mad, though nothing that Maupassant narrates actually tells us to make such an inference. A first-person narration, the Horla gives us more clues than we can interpret, because we cannot understand the narrator and do not know whether we can trust his impressions, of which we receive little or no independent verification. The Horla begins with the narrator, a prosperous young Norman gentleman, persuading us of his happiness on a beautiful May morning. He sees a splendid Brazilian three-master boat flow by his house and salutes it. This gesture evidently summons the Horla, an invisible being that we later learn has been afflicting Brazil with demonic possession and subsequent madness. Horlas are evidently refined cousins of the vampires. They drink milk and water and drain vitality from sleepers without actually drawing blood. Whatever has been happening in Brazil, we are free to doubt precisely what is going on in Normandy. Our narrator eventually sets fire to his own house to destroy his Horla, but neglects to tell the servants, who are consumed with their home. When the tale-teller apprehends that his Horla is still alive, he concludes by telling us that he will have to kill himself. Clearly, it is indeed his Horla, whether or not it made the voyage from Brazil to Normandy. The Horla is the narrator's madness, and not just the cause of madness. Has Maupassant written the story of what it means to be possessed by syphilis? At one point, the sufferer glances in the mirror and cannot see his reflection. Then he sees himself in a mist at the back of the mirror. The mist recedes until he sees himself completely, and of the mist or blocking agent he cries out, "I had seen him." The narrator says that the Horla's advent means that the reign of man is over. Magnetism, hypnotism, suggestion are all aspects of the Horla's will. "He has come," the victim cries out, and suddenly the interloper shouts his name in one's ears. "The Horla! He has come!" Maupassant invents the name Horla. Is it an ironic play upon the English word whore? That seems very remote, unless indeed Maupassant's venereal disease is the story's hidden center. The horror story is a large and fascinating genre in which Maupassant excelled, but never again as powerfully as in The Horla. I think that it is because, on some level, he knew that he prophesied his own madness and attempted suicide. Maupassant is not of the artistic eminence of Turgenev, Chekhov, Henry James, or Hemingway as a short story writer, but his immense popularity is well deserved. Someone who created both Madame Tellier's establishment, with its amiable ecstasies, and The Horla, with its convincing fright, was a permanent master of the story. Why read Maupassant? At his best, he will hold you as few others do. You receive pretty much what his narrative voice gives you. It is not God's plenty, but it pleases many and serves as an introduction to the more difficult pleasures of storytellers subtler than Maupassant. Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway's best short stories surpass even The Sun Also Rises, his only novel that seems now to be something more than a period piece. Wallace Stevens, the strongest of modern American poets, once termed Hemingway the most significant of living poets, so far as the subject of extraordinary reality is concerned. By poet here, Stevens meant the remarkable stylist of Hemingway's short stories, and by extraordinary reality, he meant a poetic realm in which consciousness takes the place of imagination. This high praise is merited by Hemingway's permanent achievements in the short story, some 15 or so masterpieces, easy to parody frequently by Hemingway himself, but impossible to forget. Frank O'Connor, who disliked Hemingway as intensely as he liked Chekhov, remarks in The Lonely Voice that Hemingway's stories illustrate a technique in search of a subject and therefore become a minor art. Let us see. Read the famous sketch called Hills Like White Elephants, 5 pages that are almost all dialogue between a young woman and her lover while they wait for a train at a station in a provincial Spanish town. They are continuing a disagreement as to the abortion he wishes her to undergo when they reach Madrid. The story catches the moment of her defeat and very likely of the death of their relationship. And that is all. The dialogue makes clear that the woman is vital and decent, while the man is a sensible emptiness, selfish and unloving. The reader is wholly with her when she responds to his "I'd do anything for you" with "Would you please, 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 please stop talking?" 7 pleases are a lot, but as repetition, they are precise and persuasive in Hills Like White Elephants. The story is beautifully prefigured in that simile of a title. Long and white, the hills across the valley of the Ebro look like white elephants to the woman, not to the man. White elephants, proverbial Siamese royal gifts to courtiers who would be ruined by the expense of their upkeep, become a larger metaphor for unwanted babies, and even more for erotic relationships too spiritually costly when a man is inadequate. Hemingway's personal mystique in Revere poses as warrior is as irrelevant to Hills Like White Elephants as its male protagonist's insistence that "you know I love you." More relevant is the remark of Hemingway's surrogate, Nick Adams, in The End of Something, when he terminates a relationship. It isn't fun anymore. I don't know many women readers who like that sentence, but it hardly is an apologia, only a very young man's self-improvement. The Hemingway story that wounds me most is another 5-pager, God Rest You Merry Gentlemen, which is almost entirely dialogue after its opening paragraphs, including an outrageous initial sentence. In those days, the distances were all very different. Dirt flew off the hills that now have been cut down, and Kansas City was very like Constantinople. You can parody that by saying, in those days, Bridgeport, Connecticut was very like Haifa. Still, we are in Kansas City on Christmas Day and listening to the conversation between 2 physicians, the incompetent Dr. Wilcox, who relies upon a limp leather-indexed volume, The Young Doctor's Friend and Guide, and the mordant Doc Fisher, who begins by quoting his co-religionist Shylock. What news along the Rialto? The news is very bad, as we learn soon enough. A boy of about 16, obsessed with purity, had come into the hospital to ask for castration. Turned away, he had mutilated himself with a razor and will probably die from loss of blood. The interest of the story centers in Doc Fisher's lucid nihilism, prophetic of Nathaniel West's Shrike in Miss Lonely Heart. Ride you, Doctor, on the day, the very anniversary of our Savior's birth? Our Savior? Ain't you a Jew? Dr. Wilcox said. So I am. It always is slipping my mind. I've never given it its proper importance. So good of you to remind me. Your Savior, that's right. Your Savior. Undoubtedly your Savior. And the ride for Palm Sunday. You, Wilcox, are the donkey upon whom I ride into Jerusalem. is the implication of that last phrase. Rancid and brilliant, Doc Fisher has peaked, as he says, into hell. His Shylockian intensity is a Hemingway-esque tribute to Shakespeare, described by Colonel Cantwell, Hemingway's surrogate, in Across the River and Into the Trees, as the winner and still the undisputed champion. When he is most ambitious in his stories, Hemingway is most Shakespearean, as in the famous quasi-autobiographical The Snows of Kilimanjaro, its author's favorite. Of the story's protagonist, the failed writer Harry, Hemingway observes, he had loved too much, demanded too much, and he wore it all out. That would be a superb critical remark to make about King Lear, Hemingway's most admired character in all of Shakespeare. More than anywhere else, Hemingway attempts and achieves tragedy in the relatively brief compass of The Snows of Kilimanjaro. The meditation of a dying man rather than the description of an action, this Baroque story is Hemingway's most intense self-chastisement, and I think that Chekhov himself, much given to that mode, would have been impressed by it. One doesn't think of Hemingway as a visionary writer, but The Snows of Kilimanjaro begins with an epigraph telling us that the snow-covered western summit of the mountain is called the House of God, and close to it is the carcass, dried and frozen, of a leopard. There is no explanation as to what a leopard could have been seeking nearly 20,000 feet above sea level. Very little is gained by saying that the leopard is a symbol of the dying Harry. Originally, in ancient Greek, a symbolon was a token for identification that could be compared to a counterpart. Commonly, we use symbol more loosely as something that stands for something else, whether by association or resemblance. If you identify the corpse of the leopard with Harry's lost but still residual ambition or aesthetic idealism as a writer, then you plunge Hemingway's story into bathos and grotesquerie. Hemingway himself did that in The Old Man and the Sea, but not in the masterful The Snows of Kilimanjaro. Harry is dying slowly of gangrene in an African hunting camp, surrounded by vultures and hyenas, palpably unpleasant presences that need not be interpreted as symbolic. Neither need the leopard be so interpreted. Like Harry, it is out of place, but the writer's vision of Kilimanjaro does seem another of Hemingway's nostalgic visions of a lost spirituality, qualified, as always, by a keen sense of nothingness, a Shakespearean nihilism. It seems useful to regard the uncanny presence of the dead leopard as a strong irony, a forerunner of Harry's vain quest to recover his identity as a writer at Kilimanjaro, rather than, say, at Paris, Madrid, Key West, or Havana. The irony is at Hemingway's own expense, insofar as Harry prophesies the Hemingway who, 19 days short of his 62nd birthday, turned a double-barreled shotgun on himself in the mountains of Idaho. Yet the story is not primarily ironical, and need not be read as a personal prophecy. Harry is a failed Hemingway. Hemingway, by being able to compose The Snows of Kilimanjaro, is precisely not a failure, at least as a writer. The best moment in the story is hallucinatory and comes just before the end. It is Harry's dying vision, though the reader cannot know that, until Harry's wife, Helen, realizes she can no longer hear him breathing. As he died, Harry dreamed that the rescue plane had come for him, but could carry only one passenger. On the visionary flight, Harry is taken up to see the square top of Kilimanjaro, great, high, and unbelievably white in the sun. This apparent image of transcendence is the most elusive moment in the story. It represents death and not the house of God. A dying man's phantasmagoria is not to be regarded as triumphal when the entire story conveys Harry's conviction that he has wasted his gifts as a writer. Yet Hemingway may have remembered King Lear's dying fantasy, in which the old mad king is persuaded that his beloved daughter Cordelia breathes again, despite her murder. If you love too much and demand too much, then you, like Lear and Harry, and at last Hemingway, will wear it all out. Fantasy for Harry takes the place of art. Hemingway was so wonderful and unexpected a story writer that I choose to end my account of him here with one of his unknown masterpieces, a splendidly ironic A Sea Change, which prefigures his posthumously published novel The Garden of Eden, with its portrayal of ambiguous sexualities. In A Sea Change, we are in a Parisian bar, where an archetypal Hemingway-esque couple are engaged in a crisp dialogue on infidelity. It takes the reader only a few exchanges to realize that the sea change of the title does not refer to the woman who is determined to begin or continue a lesbian relationship, yet wishes also to return to the man. It is the man who is suffering a sea change, presumably into the writer who will compose the rich and strange The Garden of Eden. "I'm a different man," he twice announces to the uncomprehending bartender after the woman has left. Looking into the mirror, he sees the difference, but what he sees we are not told, though he remarks to the bartender that vice is a very strange thing. It cannot be a consciousness of vice that has made him a different man. Rather, it is his imaginative yielding to the woman's persuasive defense that has altered him forever. "We're made up of all sorts of things. You've known that. You've used it well enough," she has said to him, and he tacitly acknowledges some crucial element in the sexuality they have shared. He suffers now a sea change, but nothing of him fades in this moment of only apparent loss. Almost too deft for irony, A Sea Change is a subtle self-recognition, an erotic autobiography remarkable for its indirection and its nuanced self-acceptance. Only the finest American master of the short story could have placed so much in so slight a sketch. Flannery O'Connor. D.H. Lawrence, a superb writer of short stories, gave the reader a permanent wisdom in one brief remark: "Trust the tale, not the teller." That seems to me an essential principle in reading the stories of Flannery O'Connor, who may have been the most original tale-teller among Americans since Hemingway. Her sensibility was an extraordinary blend of Southern Gothic and severe Roman Catholicism. So fierce a moralist is O'Connor that readers need to be wary of her tendentiousness. She has too palpable a design upon us to shock us by violence into a need for traditional faith. As teller, O'Connor was very shrewd, yet I think her best tales are far shrewder, and enforce no moral except an awakened moral imagination. O'Connor's South is wildly Protestant, not the Protestantism of Europe, but of the indigenous American religion, whether it calls itself Baptist, Pentecostal, or whatever. The prophets of that religion, snake handlers, free-thinking Christians, independent prophets, the swindlers, the mad, and sometimes the genuinely inspired, O'Connor named as natural Catholics. Except for this handful of natural Catholics, the people who throng O'Connor's marvelous stories are the damned, a category in which Flannery O'Connor cheerfully included most of her readers. I think that the best way to read her stories is to begin by acknowledging that one is among her damned, and then go on from there to enjoy her grotesque and unforgettable art of killing. A Good Man is Hard to Find remains a splendid introduction to O'Connor. A grandmother, her son and daughter-in-law, and their 3 children are on a car journey when they encounter an escaped convict, the Misfit, and his 2 subordinate killers. Upon seeing the Misfit, the grandmother foolishly declares his identity, thus dooming herself and all her family. The old lady pleads with the Misfit while her family is taken away to be shot, but O'Connor gives us one of her masterpieces in this natural theologian of a killer. Jesus, the Misfit, declares, thrown everything off balance by raising the dead in a cosmos where there is no pleasure but meanness. Dizzy and hallucinating, the terrified grandmother touches the Misfit while murmuring, "Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children." He recoils, shoots her 3 times in the chest, and pronounces her epitaph. She would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. The tale and the teller came together here, since the Misfit clearly speaks for something fierce and funny in O'Connor herself. O'Connor gives us a hypocritical and banal old lady, and a killer who is, in O'Connor's view, an instrument of Catholic grace. This is meant to be, and certainly is, outrageous, because, being damned, we are outraged by it. We would be good, O'Connor thinks, if someone were there to shoot us every minute of our lives. Why do we not resent O'Connor's palpable designs upon us? Her comic genius is certainly part of the answer. Someone who can entertain us so profoundly can damn us pretty much as she pleases. In her Good Country People, we meet the unfortunate Joy Hopewell, who possesses both a Ph.D. in philosophy and a wooden leg, and the fancy first name Hulga, which she has given herself. A brash young Bible salesman, with the improbably phallic name of Manly Pointer, divests Hulga of her wooden leg in a haystack, and then runs off with it. Hulga accurately knows herself as of the damned. Is she not a philosopher? And we can draw what moral we will from her cruelly hilarious fate. Shall we say of her, she would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to seduce her and run off with her wooden leg every minute of her life? O'Connor would have disdained my skepticism, and I am aware that my parody is defensive. But her early stories, though lively, are not her greatest. That comes in such later work as A View of the Woods and Harker's Back, and in her second novel, The Violent Bear It Away. A View of the Woods is a sublimely ugly tale, featuring the 79-year-old Mr. Fortune and his 9-year-old granddaughter, Mary Fortune Pitts. Both are dreadful, selfish, stubborn, mean, sullen monuments of pride. At the story's end, a nasty fight between the 2 closes with the grandfather killing the little girl, having throttled her and smashed her head upon a rock. In his excitement and exhaustion, Mr. Fortune has a final view of the woods during a fatal heart attack. This is all grimly impressive, but how should we interpret it? O'Connor remarked that Mary Fortune Pitts was saved and Mr. Fortune damned, but she could not explain why, since they are equally abominable persons, and the death struggle might have gone either way. It is splendid that O'Connor was so outrageous because our skepticism outraged her and inspired her art. And yet, her obsessive spirituality and absolute moral judgments cannot just sustain themselves at the reader's expense. But when I think that, I suddenly recall how close her literary tastes were to my own. She preferred Faulkner's As I Lay Dying and Nathaniel West's This Lonely Hearts to all other works of modern American fiction, and so do I. Reading Flannery O'Connor's stories and The Violent Bear It Away, I am exhilarated to the brink of fear, as I am by Faulkner and West in their grandest works, and by Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which surely O'Connor would have admired had she survived to read it. Turgenev and Chekhov, Maupassant and Hemingway were not ideologues, and the main tradition of the modern short story is certainly theirs, and not O'Connor's. And yet her verve and drive, the propulsive gusto of her comic spirit, is overwhelming. Her Catholicism might as well be holy rollerism, so far as the aesthetic effect of her fiction is concerned. There we can locate her natural shrewdness. Her mad and damned American religionists can be parodied, but the parody will not touch her assured Roman Catholicism. More than a comedian of genius, she had also the penetrating insight that religion for her countrymen and women was not the opiate, but rather the poetry of the people. Vladimir Nabokov. I pass on to a superb story by Vladimir Nabokov, The Vain Sisters, because the transition refreshes me, going from a vision of spirituality through violence to an aestheticism that plays with spiritualism. Nabokov was given to lamenting that his American English could never match the richness of his native Russian style, a lament that seems an irony when the reader confronts the baroquely rich textures of the Vain Sisters. Our narrator, himself French in origin, instructs in French literature at a New England women's college. Nabokovian through and through, this nameless narrator is a finicky aesthete, a harmless version of Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray. The Vain Sisters are Cynthia and Sybil, whose name and suicide are borrowed from Dorian Gray's victimized girlfriend, though both young women are more Henry Jamesian than Wildian, since they are evanescent and indirect personalities. The nameless French professor was the teacher of Sybil and the estranged close friend of Cynthia, but the lover of neither. The narrator begins with a chance hearing of Cynthia's death by heart attack. He is taking his usual Sunday afternoon stroll and stops to watch a family of brilliant icicles drip-dropping from the eaves of a frame house. A long paragraph is devoted to these icicles, and later he observes the lean ghost, the elongated umbra cast by a parking meter upon some damp snow, had a strange ruddy tinge. At the story's end, he wakes from a vague dream of Cynthia, but cannot unravel it. I could isolate, consciously little. Everything seemed blurred, yellow-clouded, yielding nothing tangible. Her inept acrostics, maudlin evasions, theopathies, every recollection formed ripples of mysterious meaning. Everything seemed yellowly blurred, elusive, lost. The self-parody of Nabokov's own style here testifies that Sybil's acrostics are not as inept as Cynthia's. Work out the acrostic formed by the initial letters of this passage, and you get Icicles by Cynthia, Meter from me, Sybil. Our narrator is haunted, then, by both women, but why? Probably because the Vain Sisters glided ghost-like through their existence anyway. Death seems hardly to alter them. But why the French professor as the object of these charmingly mischievous shades? It is possible that the narrator, being a Nabokovian self-parody, is being punished for Nabokov's own aestheticism and skepticism. Unlike Maupassant's The Horla, which represents a gathering madness, The Vain Sisters is an authentic though highly original ghost story. Sybil Vane, the day after taking a mid-year examination in French literature given by the narrator, kills herself in reaction to being abandoned by her married lover. We get to know the older sister, Cynthia, rather better after Sybil's death. Cynthia is a painter and a spiritualist and has evolved a theory of intervenient auras. These auras of the deceased intervene benignly in the lives of their survivors. After the narrator's skepticism alienates Cynthia, she accurately also calls him a prig and a snob. He breaks with her and forgets her until he is told of her death. Discreetly, she haunts him until the climactic dream he cannot decipher and the final acrostic, which we can. Nabokov's story, though brief, is replete with literary allusions to Emerson's transparent eyeball from his nature, and Coleridge's person from Prologue, who supposedly interrupted the composition of Kubla Khan. There are also vivid manifestations of Oscar Wilde and of Tolstoy at a séance, and an extraordinary general atmosphere of literary preciosity. What makes The Vane Sisters magical is that the reader's own skepticism is overcome by the curious charm of these amiable women, whose existences and after-auras alike are so tenuous. The reader is separated by Nabokov from the narrator's priggishness, but not necessarily from his skepticism. Pragmatically, though, skepticism makes little difference here. These ghosts are persuasive precisely because they are so uninsistent upon persuasion. One doesn't think of the author of Pale Fire and Lolita as a Chekhovian writer. Nabokov adored Nikolai Gogol, whose spirit was fiercer and more lunatic than Chekhov's. But Cynthia and Sybil Vane would be at home in Chekhov. Like so many of his women, they represent the pathos of the unlived life. Nabokov, not much interested in pathos, prefers them as whimsical ghosts. Jorge Luis Borges. The modern short story, so long as it remains Chekhovian, is impressionistic. This is as true of James Joyce's Dubliners as it is of Hemingway or Flannery O'Connor. Perception and sensation, the aesthetic of Walter Pater, are centered in the impressionistic short story, including the major stories of Thomas Mann and Henry James. Something very different came into modern storytelling with the phantasmagoria of Franz Kafka, a prime precursor of Jorge Luis Borges, who can be said to have replaced Chekhov as the major influence upon the short stories of the second half of our century. Stories now tend to be either Chekhovian or Borgesian. Only rarely are they both. Borges's collected fictions insist always upon their self-conscious status as artifices, unlike Chekhov's impressionistic glances at the truths of our existence. The reader, encountering Borges and his many followers, is wise to entertain very different expectations than she brings to Chekhov and his vast school. One is not going to hear the lonely voice of a submerged element in the population, but rather a voice haunted by a plethora of literary voices, forerunners. What greater glory for a god than to be absolved of the world, is Borges's great outcry as he professes his Alexandrianism. If there is a god in Chekhov's stories, then he cannot be absolved of the world, nor can we. But for Borges, the world is a speculative illusion, or a labyrinth, or a mirror reflecting other mirrors. How to read Borges is necessarily more a lesson in how to read all his precursors than it is an exercise in self-understanding. That does not make Borges less entertaining or less enlightening than Chekhov, but it does make him very different. For Borges, Shakespeare is at once everyone and nobody. He is the living labyrinth of literature itself. For Chekhov, Shakespeare is obsessively the author of Hamlet, and Prince Hamlet becomes the ship in which Chekhov sails, quite literally in At Sea, the first story published under Chekhov's own name. Borges's relativism is an absolute. Chekhov's is conditional. The reader, enthralled by Chekhov and his disciples, can enjoy a personal relation to the story, but Borges enchants the reader into the realm of impersonal forces, where Shakespeare's own memory is a vast abyss into which one can tumble, losing whatever remnants exist of oneself. Of Borges's fictions, every reader will create a select list. Mine includes Cologne, Ugbar, Orbis Tertius, Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, Death and the Compass, The South, The Immortal, and The Alephii. Of this half-dozen, I will center here only on the first, in some detail, so as to help culminate this section on how to read the short story and why we need to go on reading the best examples of it that we can find. Cologne, Ugbar, Orbis Tertius begins with a disarming sentence in Andrew Hurley's eloquent translation. I owe the discovery of Ugbar to the conjunction of a mirror and an encyclopedia. That sentence is the purest Borges. Add a labyrinth to a mirror and an encyclopedia, and you would have his world. Of all Borges's fictions, Cologne, Ugbar, Orbis Tertius is the most sublimely outrageous, and yet the reader is seduced into finding the incredible credible because of Borges's skill at employing real people, his best and most literary friends, and places, a big old country house, the National Library, a familiar hotel. The reader grants the same natural reality to the fictive Herbert Ashe as to the actual Bioy Casares, while Ugbar and Cologne, though phantasmagorias, seem little more marvelous than the National Library. An encyclopedia that deals entirely with an invented world goes a long way towards verifying that world simply because it is an encyclopedia, a work to which we are accustomed to grant authority. This is disconcerting, but in a diverting way. As Tolonian objects and concepts spread through the nations, reality caves in. Borges's dry irony is never more imposing. The truth is, it wanted to cave in. 10 years ago, any symmetry, any system with an appearance of order, dialectical materialism, anti-Semitism, Nazism, could spellbind and hypnotize mankind. Borges, a firm opponent both of Marxism and of Argentine fascism, indicts what we call reality, but not his fantasy of Cologne, which is part of the living labyrinth of imaginative literature. Cologne may well be a labyrinth, but it is a labyrinth forged by men, a labyrinth destined to be deciphered by men. That is to say, Cologne is a benign labyrinth where no minotaur waits at the end of the maze to devour us. Canonical literature is neither a symmetry nor a system, but a hugely proliferating encyclopedia of human desire, the desire to be more imaginative rather than to hurt another self. We are not to be spellbound nor hypnotized by Cologne, and yet, as readers, we are not given nearly enough information to decipher it. Cologne remains precisely a vast cipher to be solved only by the entire literary universe of Fantasia. Borges's story begins when he and his closest friend and sometime collaborator, the Argentine novelist Bioy Casares, sit too late at dinner in Borges's rented country house, and together behold themselves in a mirror which unsettles them. Bioy remembers a saying that he attributes to one of the heresiarchs of Ugbar. Mirrors and copulation are abominable, for they multiply the number of mankind. We are never told the identity of this Gnostic ascetic, who necessarily is Borges himself, but Bioy thinks he found the saying in an article on Ugbar in what purported to be a reprint, under another title, of the 1902 Encyclopedia Britannica. The article does not appear in the edition available in Borges's rented house. The next day, Bioy brings his own relevant volume, which contains 4 pages on Ugbar. The geography and history of Ugbar are alike rather vague. The location appears to be trans-Caucasian, while the literature of Ugbar is wholly fantasy and refers to imaginary realms, including Toulon. There, the story, barely begun, would end, but for the aptly named Herbert Ashe, a reticent British engineer with whom Borges says he had desultory conversations across 8 years at a hotel both frequented. After Ashe's death, Borges finds a volume that the engineer had left in the hotel bar. A First Encyclopedia of Toulon, Volume 11, Clare to Yanger. The book has no place or date of publication and contains 1,001 pages, in clear allusion to the Arabian Nights. Absorbing these mythical pages, Borges discovers much of the nature, to call it that, of the cosmos that is Toulon. Bishop Berkeley's fierce philosophical idealism, with its conviction that nothing could be like an idea except another idea, is the primordial law of existence on Toulon. There are no causes or effects in that cosmos. The psychology and metaphysics of absolute fantasy prevail. Such was Toulon Ugbar Orbis Tertius in 1940, another item in Borges's Anthology of Fantastic Literature. A postscript, dated 1947, expands on the phantasmagoria. Toulon is explained as a benign conspiracy of Hermetists and Kabbalists across 3 centuries, but one that took its decisive turn in 1824, when the reclusive millionaire Ezra Buckley proposed that an imaginary country be converted into an invented universe. Borges sets the proposal in Memphis, Tennessee, thereby making what we now think of as Elvis Land as mysterious as ancient Memphis, Egypt. The 40 volumes of the First Encyclopedia of Toulon are completed by 1914, the year that saw the onset of World War I. In 1942, in the midst of World War II, the first objects from Toulon begin to appear. A magnetic compass whose dial letters are in a Toulonian alphabet, a small metal cone of unbearable weight, the discovery in a Memphis library of a complete set of the encyclopedia. Other objects made of unearthly material flood the nations. Reality caves in, and the world in time will be Toulon. Borges, little moved, stays in his hotel, slowly revising a Baroque translation of Sir Thomas Browne's Urn Burial, of which my own favorite sentence remains: "Life is a pure flame, and we live by an invisible sun within us." Borges, a skeptical visionary, charms us even as we accept his warning. Reality caves in all too easily. Our individual fantasies may not be as elaborate as Toulon, nor as abstract, yet Borges has sketched a universal tendency and fulfilled a fundamental yearning as to why we read. Tommaso Landolfi. Dostoevsky famously said, "We all came out from under Gogol's overcoat," a short story concerning a wretched copying clerk whose new overcoat is stolen. Disdained by the authorities, to whom he duly protests, the poor fellow dies, after which his ghost continues to search vainly for justice. Good as the story is, it is not the best of Gogol, which may be Old World Landowners or the insane The Nose. which begins when a barber at breakfast discovers a customer's nose inside a loaf of bread freshly baked by his wife. The spirit of Gogol, subtly alive in much of Nabokov, achieves its apotheosis in the triumphant Gogol's Wife by the modern Italian story writer Tommaso Landolfi, perhaps the funniest and most unnerving story that I've yet read. The narrator, Gogol's friend and biographer, reluctantly tells us the story of Gogol's wife. The actual Gogol, a religious obsessive, never married, and deliberately starved himself to death at 43 or so after burning his unpublished manuscripts. But Landolfi's Gogol, who might have been invented by Kafka or by Borges, has married a rubber balloon, a splendidly inflatable dummy who assumes different shapes and sizes at her husband's whim. Much in love with his wife, in one of her forms or another, Gogol enjoys sexual relations with her and bestows upon her the name Caracas, after the capital of Venezuela, for reasons known only to the mad writer. For some years all goes well, until Gogol contracts syphilis, which he rather unfairly blames upon Caracas. Ambivalence towards his silent wife gains steadily in Gogol through the years. He accuses Caracas of self-gratification and even betrayal, so that she becomes bitter and excessively religious. Finally, the enraged Gogol pumps too much air into Caracas, quite deliberately, until she bursts and scatters into the air. Collecting the remnants of Madame Gogol, the great writer burns them in the fireplace, where they share the fate of his unpublished works. Into the same fire, Gogol casts also a rubber doll, the son of Caracas. After this final catastrophe, the biographer defends Gogol from the charge of wife-beating and salutes the memory of the writer's lofty genius. The best prelude or postlude to reading Landolfi's Gogol's Wife is to read some stories by Gogol, on the basis of which we will not doubt the reality of the unfortunate Caracas. She is as likely a paramour as Gogol could ever have discovered or invented for himself. In contrast, Landolfi could hardly have composed much the same story and called it Maupassant's wife, let alone Turgenev's wife. No, it has to be Gogol and Gogol alone, and I rarely doubt Landolfi's story, particularly just after each rereading. Caracas has a reality that Borges neither seeks nor achieves for his Toulon. As Gogol's only possible bride, she seems to me the ultimate parody of Frank O'Connor's insistence that the lonely voice crying out in the modern short story is that of the submerged population. Who could be more submerged than Gogol's wife? Italo Calvino. Other masters of the short story are considered elsewhere in the volume, whether as novelists, James, or poets, T.H. Lowell. Here I wish to close with another great Italian fabulist, Italo Calvino, who died in 1985. My favorite among his books, really a universal favorite, is Invisible Cities, translated beautifully by William Weaver in 1974. A description of Calvino's invention, if rendered properly, could show others how and why Invisible Cities should be read and reread. Marco Polo is the tale-teller, and the venerable Kublai Khan his audience, as we listen also to stories about imaginary cities. The stories are only a page or two long, yet they are short stories in the Borgesian or Kafkan rather than the Chekhovian mode. Marco Polo's cities never were and never could be, and yet most readers would go there, if only they might. Calvino's invisible cities come in 11 groupings, scattered rather than bunched. Cities and Memory, desire, signs, eyes, names, the sky, as well as free cities, trading cities, continuous cities, and hidden cities. Though one can become busy keeping all these in mind, it will not do to say that each of these cities is actually the same place. Since they are all named for women, that would amount to saying that all women are one woman. The Spanish philosopher Pablo Miguel de Unamuno, but not Calvino's view. Kublai Khan, listening to Marco Polo, would certainly agree with Calvino and Polo, and not with Unamuno. The Kublai, old and weary of power, finds in Marco Polo's visionary cities a pattern that will endure after his own empire is dust. Nostalgia for lost illusions, loves that never quite were, happiness perhaps only tasted. These are the emotions Calvino evokes. In Isadora, one of the cities of memory, the foreigner hesitating between two women always encounters a third. But alas, you can arrive at Isadora only in old age. You leave Tamara without having discovered it. And in Zirma, you see a girl walking with a puma on a leash. Kublai, after many recitals, begins to note a family resemblance among the cities, but that means only that the emperor is learning